Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her trembling fingers against the cold glass of the observation deck, staring into the infinite darkness of space. Somewhere out there, beyond the scattered stars and distant galaxies, existed something that would change everything humanity thought they knew about the universe. Something massive, something impossible, something terrifying. The discovery happened 3 months ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Elena remembered the moment with perfect clarity. She had been analyzing data from the James Webb Space Telescope successor, the Horizon Array, when the numbers stopped making sense. At first, she thought it was an equipment malfunction. The gravitational readings were off the charts, pulling at space-time itself in ways that defied every known law of physics. But it wasn't a malfunction. 60,000 light-years away, in a region of space previously thought to be empty, they found it. The astronomers called it ROX's 42BB at first, following the standard naming convention. But as more data poured in, as the true scale of the discovery became apparent, someone suggested a different name, a name that would capture the sheer horror of what they were looking at. They called it Titan's Nightmare. The planet was so large that calling it a planet seemed almost insulting to the concept. It was roughly 13 times the size of Jupiter, the largest planet in our solar system. But Jupiter suddenly seemed like a marble compared to a basketball. Scientists had discovered larger celestial bodies before, of course. Brown dwarfs existed in that strange category between planet and star. But this was different. This was a planet, a true planet, and it was still growing. Elena had spent her entire career studying exoplanets. She had discovered 17 herself, each one a point of pride in her research. She had seen hot Jupiters orbiting impossibly close to their parent stars. She had analyzed super-Earths with crushing gravity and toxic atmospheres. She had even identified a few planets in the habitable zone, worlds where liquid water could theoretically exist. None of that prepared her for Titan's Nightmare. The planet existed in a binary star system, orbiting 2 massive blue giants locked in a deadly dance. The stars themselves were among the largest ever discovered, each one burning with the fury of 1,000,000 suns. They rotated around each other every 48 hours, creating gravitational chaos throughout their system. And somehow, impossibly, Titan's Nightmare held itself together in the middle of that chaos. The planet's atmosphere was a swirling storm of hydrogen, helium, and exotic compounds that shouldn't exist. Lightning bolts larger than Earth itself crackled across its surface, each one releasing more energy than humanity had used in its entire history. The winds moved at speeds approaching 40,000 kilometers per hour, creating hurricanes that could swallow Neptune whole. But the atmosphere was just the beginning. Elena pulled up the latest scan on her tablet, her eyes tracing the data that had given her nightmare for weeks. The planet's core was unlike anything in the known universe. Under pressure, so extreme it created matter in states that existed nowhere else, the core had collapsed into something new, something that bent the rules of reality. The temperature at the core exceeded 200 million degrees Celsius. That was hotter than the interior of most stars. The pressure was equally incomprehensible, millions of times greater than anything found on Earth. Under those conditions, matter didn't behave normally. Hydrogen atoms were crushed so tightly together that they formed a metallic solid. Elements that should never bond became inseparable. And in the very center, something impossible was happening. Dr. Marcus Chun, Elena's colleague and the mission's chief physicist, had a theory. He called it quantum collapse, though Elena thought that name didn't capture the true horror of what they were observing. According to Marcus, the pressure at the planet's core had become so intense that it was creating microscopic black holes. These tiny singularities would form, exist for a fraction of a second, and then evaporate in a burst of Hawking radiation. But here was the terrifying part. Each time a micro black hole formed and evaporated, it released energy, enormous amounts of energy. That energy fed back into the planet's core, creating more pressure, which created more black holes, which released more energy. It was a feedback loop, a planetary engine running on the destruction and creation of space-time itself. And it was accelerating. Elena remembered the meeting where Marcus presented his findings to the research team. The room had fallen silent as he explained what was happening. The planet wasn't just large. It was growing. Not through accumulation of matter, which would take billions of years, but through something far more fundamental. The micro black holes were pulling in matter from neighboring dimensions. Elena hadn't believed it at first. Nobody had. The idea of other dimensions was theoretical, mathematical, something that existed in equations, but not in reality. Yet the data was undeniable. Matter was appearing inside Titan's nightmare's core, coming from nowhere, adding to the planet's mass second by second. The planet was consuming reality itself to fuel its growth. Captain Sarah Morrison, commander of the research vessel Endeavour, had made the decision to get closer. They needed better data, she argued. They needed to understand what was happening. The mission had launched from Earth 16 months ago, carrying humanity's best and brightest on a one-way journey to the edge of explored space. Elena had volunteered without hesitation. This was a discovery of millennium, perhaps of all time. The chance to study something so unique, so impossible, was worth any risk. Now, staring out at the distant point of light that marked Titan's nightmare's location, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The Endeavour was still 3 weeks away from the planet at their current speed. They were traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, propelled by fusion drives that humanity had only perfected a decade ago. Yet even at this incredible velocity, the vastness of space meant their journey would take time. Time Elena used to dig deeper into the data. The planet's magnetic field was another source of concern. Jupiter's magnetic field was already powerful enough to fry unshielded electronics from millions of kilometers away. Titan's nightmare's field was proportionally larger, creating a magnetosphere that extended billions of kilometers into space. The field was so powerful it was visible, bending and distorting the light from background stars. But it was the field's effects on space-time that truly worried her. General relativity taught that massive objects curve space-time. The more massive the object, the more extreme the curvature. Earth created a gentle dimple in the fabric of reality. The sun created a deeper well. Black holes created infinite curves, points where space-time broke down entirely. Titan's nightmare existed somewhere between a planet and a black hole. The space-time around it was warped so severely that time itself ran differently. For every hour that passed on the Endeavour, slightly less time passed near the planet's surface. The effect was small now at their current distance, but as they got closer, it would become more pronounced. If they got too close, they could experience days while years passed for the rest of the universe. Elena had run the calculations a dozen times, checking and rechecking her work. There was a boundary, a point of no return. If they crossed it, the time dilation would become so extreme that they could never leave. They would be trapped, watching the universe age around them, seeing stars die and galaxies collide while they experienced mere moments. She had shared her findings with Captain Morrison. The captain had acknowledged the risk, then ordered them to continue anyway. They would be careful, she promised. They would maintain a safe distance. But what was a safe distance from something like Titan's nightmare? Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the mission xenobiologist, had raised a question that nobody wanted to answer. In their weekly briefing, she had stood up and asked the impossible. Could something live there? The room had erupted in debate. Life as they knew it couldn't possibly survive in such an environment. The temperature, the pressure, the radiation, the gravitational forces, all of it was instantly lethal to any known organism. But Yuki wasn't talking about life as they knew it. She presented research on extremophiles, organisms that thrive in conditions once thought impossible for life. Bacteria that lived in boiling acid, organisms that survived in the vacuum of space, creatures that fed on radiation and thrived under crushing pressure. If life could adapt to Earth's extremes, why not to something even more extreme? Elena had dismissed the idea at first, but the more she thought about it, the more it haunted her. The planet was creating its own reality, pulling matter from other dimensions, generating energy through quantum processes. What if something had evolved there? Something adapted to those impossible conditions? What if they weren't alone? The Endeavour shuddered, pulling Elena from her thoughts. She grabbed the railing, steadying herself as the ship's artificial gravity compensated for the disturbance. A moment later, the intercom crackled to life. All personnel to stations. We're entering the outer magnetosphere. Elena ran to the bridge, her heart pounding. They were still 2 weeks away from the planet, but already they were feeling its effects. The magnetic field was stronger than predicted, reaching farther into space than their models had suggested. Captain Morrison stood at the center of the bridge, her face illuminated by holographic displays showing the ship's status. "Report," she commanded. "Magnetic field strength is 3 times higher than projected." Marcus called out from his station. "We're experiencing interference with our navigation systems. Can we compensate?" "Working on it, Captain. But if the field keeps increasing at this rate, we'll need to adjust our approach vector." Elena took a position at the sensor array, fingers flying across the controls as she pulled up the latest readings. What she saw made her blood run cold. "Captain, the planet has grown." Morrison turned to her, eyes narrowing. "How much?" 7% since our last measurement 3 days ago. Its mass has increased by nearly 8 billion trillion tons. The bridge fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. The growth was accelerating. The feedback loop Marcus had described wasn't just theoretical. It was happening right now, and it was speeding up. "How long until it reaches critical mass?" Morrison asked quietly. Elena ran the calculations, her hands shaking as she input the variables. The answer appeared on her screen, and she felt her stomach drop. 6 months. Maybe 7. After that, the planet will have enough mass to collapse into a black hole. She looked up at Morrison, seeing her own fear reflected in the captain's eyes. "And when it does, it will consume everything in this system. The twin stars, the other planets, all of it will be pulled in. It'll create a black hole roughly 5 times the mass of our sun." Morrison straightened, her jaw set with determination. "Then we have 6 months to study it and get home. All departments. I want updated models every 6 hours. Elena, Marcus, figure out if there's any way to slow the growth or stop it." "Captain," Elena said softly, "I'm not sure anything can stop it. This is fundamental physics. We're watching the birth of a black hole in real time. Then we document it. We learn everything we can. This information could be vital for humanity's understanding of the universe." Morrison paused and added, "And if we can't stop it, we at least need to warn any civilizations in neighboring systems. A black hole of that size will affect stellar positions for hundreds of light years around." Over the following days, the Endeavor crept closer to Titan's nightmare. The planet grew larger in their view screens, transforming from a point of light to a visible disk. It was beautiful in a terrible way, its atmosphere swirling with colors that shouldn't exist. Purples and greens mixed with angry reds and oranges, creating patterns that hurt to look at for too long. Elena spent every waking hour at her station, gathering data, running simulations, trying to understand. The more she learned, the more terrified she became. The planet's rotation was another anomaly, something that massive should rotate slowly, its own gravity fighting against the angular momentum. Instead, Titan's nightmare completed a full rotation every 8 hours. The surface moved at speeds that should tear the planet apart, yet somehow it held together. Marcus had an explanation for that, too. The magnetic field, he theorized, was holding it together. The field was so powerful that it actually reinforced the planet's structure, preventing the centrifugal force from ripping it apart. But that created another problem. The rotation was accelerating. Every day, the planet spun a little faster. The magnetic field grew stronger to compensate, but there would be a limit. Eventually, not even the magnetic field would be enough. The planet would tear itself apart, scattering its mass across the system in a cataclysm that would destroy everything nearby, including the Endeavor. "We need to leave," Elena told Morrison during a private meeting. "Captain, we've gathered enough data. We understand what's happening. Staying longer is suicide." Morrison looked tired. She had aged years in the few weeks since they entered the system. "I know what you're saying." "Elena, I do, but we're scientists. This is what we signed up for, to push the boundaries of knowledge, even when it's dangerous. There's a difference between dangerous and impossible. If that planet tears itself apart while we're here, there's no escape. And if it collapses into a black hole before we can reach minimum safe distance, we're trapped. I've run the numbers too, Morrison said quietly. We have time. Not much, but enough. 3 more weeks of study. Then we run for home at maximum burn. We'll make it. Elena wanted to argue, but she saw the determination in Morrison's eyes. The captain had made her decision. They were staying. The discovery came during the 2nd week of their close approach. Yuki Tanaka had been analyzing the spectroscopic data from the planet's upper atmosphere when she noticed something odd. Patterns in the chemical composition. Structures that seemed almost organized. Look at this, she said, pulling up her findings on the main display. The bridge crew gathered around, studying the data. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. There, in the swirling chaos of Titan's nightmare's atmosphere, were what appeared to be stable formations, not clouds or storms, but something else, something that maintained its structure despite the violent winds and extreme temperatures. Could they be atmospheric beasts? Marcus suggested. We've theorized about the possibility of life in gas giants before, organisms that float in the upper atmosphere, feeding on complex chemistry. Not at these temperatures, Yuki countered. Nothing biological could survive here. These would need to be made of something else entirely. Elena zoomed in on one of the formations. It was enormous, thousands of kilometers across, with a structure that resembled a spiral. As she watched, it moved, shifting through the atmosphere with apparent purpose. It's not random, she whispered. It's navigating. It's alive. The implications hit everyone at once. Life had evolved on Titan's nightmare. Not life as they understood it, not carbon-based organisms with DNA and cells. Something fundamentally different. Something that existed in conditions that should preclude any form of organization. They spent the next 3 days studying the formations. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered throughout the atmosphere. They moved in patterns that suggested communication. They merged and split, exchanging matter in what might have been reproduction or cooperation. They were intelligent. The discovery should have been celebrated. First contact with alien life, even if it was unimaginably different from humanity. Instead, Elena felt only dread, because if these creatures had evolved on Titan's nightmare, if they had adapted to its extreme conditions, what would happen when the planet died? Would they die with it, or would they find a way to escape? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. Elena was off duty, trying to catch a few hours of sleep, when the alarms blared throughout the ship. She bolted from her quarters and ran to the bridge, arriving just as Captain Morrison was organizing the crew. What happened? Elena demanded. Marcus pointed at the view screen. One of them left the planet. On the display, one of the atmospheric formations had risen from Titan's nightmare surface. It had grown larger as it ascended, pulling in matter from the upper atmosphere. Now it hung in space, a massive spiral of exotic matter held together by magnetic fields. And it was moving toward the Endeavor. Evasive maneuvers, Morrison ordered. Get us away from that thing. The ship's engines roared to life, pushing them away from the approaching entity. But it followed, accelerating to match their speed. It wasn't attacking, Elena realized. It was curious. Open a channel, she said suddenly. All frequencies. Let's try to communicate. Morrison looked at her like she was insane. Communicate? Elena, we don't even know if it thinks in ways we can understand. Then let's find out. This might be our only chance. The captain hesitated, then nodded. Do it. Elena worked quickly, programming the ship's communication array to broadcast across every possible frequency. She included mathematical sequences, prime numbers, representations of physical constants, anything that might indicate intelligence. The entity stopped pursuing them. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ship's sensors went haywire. Data poured in, overwhelming their systems. Not random noise, but information. Complex, structured information transmitted through modulated magnetic fields. Elena's equipment tried to interpret it, translating the alien communication into something humans could understand. What she saw on her screen made her heart race. The entity wasn't just intelligent. It was ancient, Its race had existed on Titan's nightmare for millions of years, evolving as the planet evolved. They had watched it grow, adapting to its increasingly extreme conditions. They had developed technology unlike anything humanity had conceived, built not from metal and circuits, but from organized magnetic fields and exotic matter. And they knew the planet was dying. The entity's message was clear. Titan's nightmare had entered its final phase. In less than 4 months, it would collapse. The atmospheric creatures, everything they had built and learned, would be destroyed. They couldn't leave. They were too dependent on the extreme conditions of their home world. In any other environment, they would simply disperse. They were asking for help. Elena stared at the message, her mind reeling. How could they help? How could humanity possibly do anything against forces as cosmic? They were insects watching a mountain fall, powerless to stop it. But maybe they didn't need to stop it. Maybe they just needed to preserve it. Marcus, she said, slowly, an idea forming. Could we create a stable environment for them? A magnetic containment field strong enough to simulate their home conditions. Marcus looked doubtful. The energy requirements would be astronomical. We need a power source equivalent to a small star. They have that power source, Elena said, pointing at Titan's nightmare. The planet itself. What if we could extract some of these entities before the collapse, bring them somewhere safe, and use the energy released during the collapse to power a containment system? That's insane, Marcus said. But he was already running calculations, his fingers flying across his keyboard. Actually, wait. If we position collection rays at specific points around the planet, we could harvest the magnetic flux during the collapse. The energy release would be massive, more than enough to power containment fields for centuries. Morrison stepped forward. Could we build something like that in 4 months? We need help, Marcus admitted. Resources, equipment, expertise we don't have on the Endeavor. But if we sent the data back to Earth now, if we got every space agency and corporation working together, maybe, just maybe. Elena sent the message that night. Everything they had learned, all their data, all their theories. She included a desperate plea for humanity to come together, to help save a species they had only just discovered. She had no idea if anyone would listen. The weeks that followed were the longest of Elena's life. They continued studying Titan's nightmare, documenting its death throes. The planet was visibly changing now, its rotation speeding up to dangerous levels. The atmospheric storms had grown so violent that they were tearing away the upper layers of gas, creating a massive cloud around the planet. The atmospheric entities were dying. Elena watched helplessly as their numbers dwindled. Some were torn apart by the increasing violence. Others simply faded, unable to maintain coherence in the destabilizing environment. But some survived. The strongest, the most adaptable, they learned to ride the storms, using the chaos to their advantage. They were evolving in real time, adapting to conditions that changed by the hour. Then, 3 months after their initial message, the response came. Humanity had listened. Space agencies, private companies, research institutions, even rival nations had set aside their differences. They were building a fleet, dozens of ships carrying equipment, resources, and the most advanced technology humanity could produce. They were coming, but they would arrive too late. Elena ran the calculations again and again, hoping she was wrong. But the numbers didn't lie. The fleet would arrive in 4 months. Titan's nightmare would collapse in 3. They were alone. Captain Morrison called a meeting of all senior staff. Her face was grave as she addressed them. We have a decision to make. We can leave now, get to safe distance before the collapse, and wait for the fleet to arrive. Or we can stay and do what we can with what we have. What can we do? Someone asked. We don't have the equipment to save them. We have the Endeavor, Morrison said quietly. We could modify the ship's magnetic containment systems, use them to create a stable environment. It wouldn't be much. We could maybe save a few dozen entities at most, but it would be something. Elena understood what Morrison was suggesting. The modifications would drain their fuel reserves. They would be stranded here, unable to reach safe distance before the collapse. They would die saving a handful of alien creatures. I'm not ordering anyone to stay, Morrison continued. We have 2 transport shuttles. Anyone who wants to leave can do so. You'll have enough fuel to get clear, and the fleet can pick you up when they arrive. But I'm staying. The Endeavor is my ship, and I'm seeing this through." One by one, the crew members spoke up. Not a single person chose to leave. They had come this far together. They would see it through together. The modifications took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of desperate work. Cannibalizing ship systems, rerouting power, building containment fields that had never been tested at this scale. Elena barely slept, driven by the knowledge that every hour counted. When they were ready, the Endeavor descended into Titan's nightmare's upper atmosphere. The ship shuddered as it entered the storm. The view screen showed nothing but violent chaos, colors and patterns that made Elena's eyes water. The temperature outside reached thousands of degrees. The pressure tried to crush the ship like a tin can, but they held together. Elena activated the containment fields, sending out a signal to the atmospheric entities. "Come to us. We can save you. Not all of you, but some. Your species will survive." They came. Not dozens, but hundreds. They surrounded the Endeavor, drawn by the promise of salvation. Elena had to make a choice. Which ones would they save? She chose the youngest. The newest entities, barely formed, with their whole existence ahead of them. She watched through sensors as they entered the containment fields, settling into the magnetic structures that would become their new home. 53 entities. That was all they could fit. 53 survivors from a civilization millions of years old. The Endeavor pulled away from the planet, climbing back into space. They didn't have enough fuel to escape the system, but they made it far enough to give the fleet a chance. Titan's nightmare's collapse was beautiful and terrible. The planet's rotation reached critical speed, and for a moment it seemed to freeze. Then it tore apart, scattering its mass in an expanding cloud of exotic matter and energy. The cloud compressed under its own gravity, growing denser, hotter, darker. And then, with a final pulse of radiation that lit up the entire system, it collapsed into a black hole. The Endeavor was caught in the gravitational wave, pulled toward the event horizon. Morrison fired every thruster they had left, fighting against the pull. It wasn't enough. Elena watched the black hole grow larger in the view screens, accepting their fate. They had saved 53 entities. 53 pieces of an alien civilization that would survive to tell their story. It was enough. Then the fleet arrived. Dozens of ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, their powerful engines fighting against the black hole's pull. They snagged the Endeavor with magnetic grapples, their combined thrust slowly, impossibly, pulling them away. Elena collapsed in her chair, tears streaming down her face as the black hole receded. They had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. The journey home took 8 months. 8 months of recuperation, of processing what they had experienced, of learning to communicate with their alien passengers. The atmospheric entities were curious about humanity, asking endless questions about Earth and its inhabitants. They told stories, too. Stories of Titan's nightmare, of the billions of years it had existed, of the civilizations that had risen and fallen on its surface. They shared knowledge that would take humanity centuries to fully understand. When Endeavor finally entered Earth's orbit, Elena stood at the observation deck one last time. She looked down at her home world, so small and fragile compared to the giants she had witnessed. Somewhere in the ship's containment fields, 53 alien entities swirled and danced, alive because a handful of humans had decided their lives were worth saving. The biggest planet in the universe had been terrifying. It had challenged everything Elena thought she knew about physics, about life, about the cosmos itself. But standing there, watching Earth turn slowly below, Elena realized something important. The universe was full of terrors. Yes, it was vast and cold and utterly indifferent to human existence. But it was also full of wonders. And sometimes, if you were brave enough, if you were willing to risk everything, you could save something precious from the dark. Elena pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the warmth of her reflection. They had faced the impossible and survived. They had witnessed the death of a world and saved those who called it home. They had looked into the face of cosmic horror and chosen compassion. That, Elena thought, was what made humanity special. Not their intelligence or their technology, but their capacity to care. even for creatures so alien they barely understood them, even when it cost everything. She smiled, turning away from the window. There was work to do, facilities to build, environments to create, futures to secure. 53 entities needed a new home, and humanity would give it to them. The biggest planet in the universe had been terrifying, but the smallest acts of kindness could be powerful enough to defy even the pull of the black hole.